Welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast, a podcast for creatives. I'm your host, Tammy Takeishi. Join me for compelling conversations with artists, actors, authors, musicians, and other creatives about the impact of the creative and fine arts in their lives and our ever-changing world. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal Podcast. Today I'm joined by my friend and author, Paulette Kennedy, and she crafts character-driven, upmarket historic fiction with feminist themes and a speculative bent. In her novels, you'll find positive LGBTQ plus representation, women living on the fringes of society, page-turning plots, and supernatural metaphors for the challenges, joys, triumphs, and societal concerns women faced in the past as well as today, all filtered through a Gothic lens. And this is Paulette's second time on the podcast. The last time she was on, we were promoting her book, The Witch of Tin Mountain. She also has Parting the Veil. And her newest book out is The Devil and Mrs. Davenport. So I'm really excited to have you on the show and to talk about your new book and lots of other creative stuff. So welcome.
Thanks, Tammy. It's good to be back. I'm glad to be here.
I was wondering if you could tell the listeners a little bit about how you got into writing and then about your current book.
Well, I started writing really young, whenever I was in elementary school. And my teachers told me that I had an aptitude for it. I had loved to read from the time before I started kindergarten. My mom actually taught me how to read, and she was an avid reader. So books had always been a major part of my life. So I feel like it was kind of a little bit of a natural progression for me to go from being an avid reader to a writer. And once I got in college, I started to explore the avenues of commercial fiction and had an interest in becoming a novelist. And my first few attempts were failures. I never finished a full manuscript. And honestly, I did not finish a full manuscript until I was in my early 40s. And that was the manuscript that eventually became Parting the Veil. I had a lot of false starts, and I started getting critique and started learning about what it was like to write for the commercial fiction market. And all of that was very helpful. But until I could actually get that first manuscript finished, I really couldn't break into the industry because you have to have a complete manuscript in order to query. So that was kind of how everything got started. And in my 45th year, I started querying the manuscript, and I had a lot of interest from agents. Nothing really panned out until after I entered a pitch contest on Twitter that's no longer in existence called PitMad. My tweet went viral, and I got a lot of interest from agents. I sent my queries out, and I ended up signing with my agent just a couple weeks after that. And then the book went out on sub, and that book, Parting the Veil, went on to be published in my 46th year. So that's all to say that it's never too late. I took the majority of my 20s and 30s off from writing to raise my son and also to just have time to myself with my family to do a lot of things that I wanted to do that I felt like with my photography especially, that were ways to tell stories and to learn about people and to develop the skills that I would need as an author. One of the things that seems kind of innocuous that I really feel like helped contribute a great deal to my voice as an author was when I was a hairstylist. I was a hairstylist for over 20 years, and communicating with people and being in close contact with people, listening to them talk, hearing their stories really helped me with my dialogue. It helped me with developing characters and empathy and all of the things that you need in order to write a full-fledged book. So I really feel like when I'm giving advice to writers, the best advice that I can give is to just get out there and live your life, read a lot. And when you start writing, all of that will kind of work itself out and find its way into your stories. and have a little bit more, you'll have a little bit more to pull from, a deeper well to pull from.
I love that. I completely agree. It's good to have so many different life experiences because you never know where that may end up or how that might spark a scene or a conversation or a novel, you know.
Exactly. Like there are so many different things I've experienced in my life, and not everything I've experienced, of course, makes it into my books. But when people give you the advice of writing what you know, I think so much of that has to do with how you've filtered the experiences that you've had as a person. And a lot of really young people are fantastic writers. And, it's wonderful if you can break in when you're young. And, I have all the admiration for younger people who are doing this. But there's something to be said too for middle-aged and older writers and the wealth of experience they bring. And I love, like, I have a mentee right now who's 71 years old, and we've had lots of conversations about this. And, she's wondered if it's too late for her to break into traditional publishing. And I'm like, no, it's absolutely not too late. There's so many stories of authors whose very first books weren't published until their 60s or 70s. So it can happen at any age. And I'm almost 50 now, and my third book is getting ready to be published in just a couple weeks. And I'll have my fourth one out in 2025. So there's just no limit to what you can do. And, people say, don't give up, don't give up. And well, I do believe that that's kind of an important to have that fortitude. It's also okay to take breaks and to take years off from writing if you need to have those other experiences that I was just talking about, like traveling and getting to know yourself and having a lot of relationships and interactions with other people to where that can help inform your writing. All of that counts as writing, in my opinion.
Very, very true. And of course, your newest book, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, what sort of inspired that particular story? And I also was wondering, how different was it to write your third book versus your very first book?
Well, The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is fairly different from my first two books. It's still Gothic fiction. It's set at mid-century. It's about a young wife and mother who develops sudden psychic abilities after a short illness. She starts hearing the voices of the dead and seeing the dead, and simultaneously, a young woman goes missing in her small Missouri town, which is loosely based on my hometown of Springfield, Missouri, where I grew up. And a lot of people from Springfield will recognize a lot of landmarks and such that are no longer in Springfield, but there's a lot of nostalgia for where I'm from within that book. What made it different for me and what inspired that book was I really wanted to write a book that was somewhat homage to homemakers and women who work at home, because I don't see them as characters as often in novels, and the quiet ways in which women hold up the world and support the world and do all of the things that other people don't want to do in order for other people to do the things that they want to do. Namely, in Loretta's case, my main character, her contributions was supporting her husband, enabled him to have a successful career. And I think often homemakers are looked down upon by modern feminists because, you're making a choice to stay home and not go out into the workplace. But back in the 50s, it really wasn't as much of a choice because women didn't have as many options available to them for careers. And so most women married fairly young, had children right away, especially right after World War II when their husbands came home. That's why we had the baby boom. And they were homemakers. That's what they did. That's what my mother did. That's what my grandmother did. And I saw how hard they worked and how it was thankless work and it was very strenuous work. But at the same time, it was not always counted as work. And there's kind of this erroneous idea that women who stay at home with their families are contributing less than women who join the workforce. And I really disagree with that, having been in both worlds. I can speak to that because I have been in both worlds. I was a single mom. I had a full-time career as a hairstylist when I had my child. And then after my husband and I moved to California, we moved out here for him to have more opportunities with his work. And I basically became a housewife at that point. And so I saw just how much work happens in the home. And domestic work is not easy and it never ends and you don't get a break. And I remember, thinking a lot to myself, especially during the pandemic when we were all stuck in our homes, how, when we have a job, we have our commute. So we have that downtime where we can listen to music and have time to ourselves and all of that. And when we're at home all the time, especially if we have children with our families, we don't have that downtime just to ourselves. And so I think a lot of women and Loretta kind of came about. I was inspired to write her because I got to thinking about what that might be like for a woman in the 1950s who didn't have that like release valve of just being able to, go to her job and have an identity outside of her family and her home life. And I read a lot of memoirs based in the 1950s about women who lived lifestyles like that, and read Shirley Jackson's entire catalog of work because Shirley was a huge inspiration for Loretta as well as my own mother and what she experienced as a young woman in the 50s and 60s. So there were a lot of inspirations for that book. The title itself just kind of came to me out of the blue one day as I was putting away groceries of all things. And the more I got to thinking about the title, it's kind of funny how inspiration hits, but a Davenport is a form of a sofa too, right? So a Davenport is a form of a sofa, and Loretta very much feels like a part of the furniture a lot of the time to her family. She feels like she's invisible. She feels like she's doesn't really belong, but she's used and all of the things that she's contributing to her family aren't always acknowledged. And so I think it's a very apt title, even though it kind of came to me just out of the blue. It kind of makes sense, that whole with Davenport being a type of sofa and Loretta being part of the furniture. And I think a lot of women of that era felt that way.
I love it when titles have a deeper meaning, whether it's intended or not, or just by chance, and it works out really well. And I also love that the title is almost stylistically a throwback to older movies and books and the way that they title those as well.
Yes, there's actually a Gothic novel that starts The Devil and Mrs. Divine, I think. The Devil and Mrs. Divine is kind of a classic Gothic novel. I can't remember who the author was, but it does kind of sound old-fashioned. It's one of the titles that ended up working and that my marketing team and publisher ended up keeping of my working titles. It's not always the case. Anyone in publishing knows, like you can give them a title and they may or may not use it. And that's more of a marketing decision, than anything. So I was kind of glad that one stuck because I think it's kind of a catchy title. So
yeah, it is. I guess it's a good thing there's a marketing team behind titling since they, know the psychology behind things. But I think it would be hard if you have your heart set on a certain title and then like the team goes with something else, If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link.
Yeah, it would be hard. Parting the Veil wasn't Parting the Veil whenever it sold. It was The Gloaming Veil, which had been its working title for over 2 years. And so that was a little bit hard for me to let that go. But ultimately, I think it was the right choice. Again, a decision by the marketing team. I had say so in it and they gave me several to choose from, and that was the one that kind of stuck. But yeah, I was pretty lucky with The Witch of Tin Mountain. They kept that one. That was my working title. And then The Devil and Mrs. Davenport. We'll see with book 4. Working title for that one right now is The Last Light of Autumn. So we'll see if that one sticks.
Ooh, I like that one.
Thank you.
If you need another vote.
Well, it has an artistic element, and there's actually a painting in the novel that is titled that. So that's where the title comes from.
Nice. I think titling is one of the most fun, but also difficult parts about writing.
Yeah, it really is. It's hard to narrow down your book to the feel or the emotion that you want to evoke, and titles are very much a big part, along with the cover, of what sells a book. People say don't judge a book by its cover, but we absolutely do every single time we go to buy a book. So they are very important, and that's why for the most part, it's like it's good to know that you can trust your marketing team to make the right decisions. I do think there have been some books that have been unfortunately titled, but for the most part, I really feel like marketing usually knows what they're doing when it comes to titles. So I try not to get too attached to a title for that reason.
Obviously, tropes are most commonly associated with romance books, but I was just wondering, as an author as well as a reader, what are some of your favorite tropes that you encounter or enjoy writing?
There's a lot of tropes that I really love in fiction and Gothic fiction, especially, and I incorporate some of those tropes. I really love the sense of isolation, the trope of isolation, which is a recurring one with Gothic. I love secret babies. I think secret babies are fun. For romance, I love There's Only One Bed. I love enemies to lovers and lovers to enemies. Lovers to enemies is actually one of my favorites, and something I used in Parting the Veil. So, and just also the house as a metaphor, that is a recurring like motif in all of my work. And some of the authors I admire most, like Shirley Jackson, also use that as a recurring motif. Gosh, a woman in peril, of course, with Gothic fiction, especially the young woman in peril. The imperiled child is also a common theme, a common trope in Gothic fiction, and that kind of gives the young woman a goal or something that she can work toward, is helping this child who is imperiled somehow. They tend to tie together. Of course, the woman running from the haunted house in her nightgown or exploring the forbidden wing of the house. I love all of those. They never get old to me. I've read so many books with those tropes, and I never get tired of them. And there's always, every author has their own unique spin on these kind of tropes with Gothic fiction. And that's one of the things I enjoy the most about it. Gothic fiction readers are very, very loyal, and they eat and read Gothic fiction and tropes like they're candy. And that's one of the reasons why I write it. It's a very niche genre. Most Gothic fiction isn't going to hit like a major bestseller list, and I'm quite frankly okay with that. It's writing what I love and finding a readership who will follow you for every single book and buy every book that you write. And that's more important to me than like breaking out huge with one book, because I really want to reach readers who enjoy the kind of stories that I write, the kind of stories I like to read.
I can't remember if I asked this in our first podcast, but was there a book from your younger years or even your childhood that really stuck with you and resonated throughout your life?
Oh, there were several. I would say if we're talking about Gothic fiction, probably Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre was one of those books that my mother introduced to me. It was her favorite novel. And I've read that book several times. I've also read Wuthering Heights several times, and I'm actually rereading it right now because my work in progress has some nods to Wuthering Heights. So I wanted to make sure that any of the callbacks or anything that I made in my current work in progress were accurate to what Emily Bronte did. But I think Jane Eyre, to me, it's so important as a work of fiction because it's one of the first examples of early like proto-feminism in the genre. Jane's agency is very much there, and she leaves. It's one of the things, she leaves and she comes back, and she leaves and she comes back of her own free will. And at the time period that that novel was written in, that was very rare for a woman to do. That's one of the things I enjoy about it. And there are just so many books that I read in my youth. Rebecca was another book that I read. I also read V.C. Andrews, because a lot of women of my generation read V.C. Andrews. And I think that kind of helped inform the little bit of twisted gothic horror that kind of comes out in some of my books, although some of the stuff that V.C. Andrews wrote about I'm not super comfortable with, but it was still a very formative series in my youth, and a lot of women my age read those books because we didn't really have young adult literature, so we were always like stealing our mother's books and reading them.
If you could write in any genre other than what you're writing in, just for fun, what do you think you would like to try?
I've thought about this a lot, and I have thought about like expanding and writing in other genres. And I've thought romance, because I enjoy reading romance. But horror, I really want to write full on horror. Like if I ever like branched out and wanted to write in a completely different genre that still had relevance to what I'm currently writing, it would be that. And I think that it would kind of be an easy jump for me, since I'm already writing Gothic fiction, because a lot of the tropes are similar. They're just kind of ramped up a little bit more. Yeah, I would really love to break into just like general horror as a genre. I grew up reading Stephen King too. I love Stephen King and read as many Stephen King books as I could get my hands on whenever I was young. So he's always been an influence on me.
I find that horror is so fascinating, but would be, at least for me, really difficult to write. And I don't know if it's because I like have a mental block where I just don't want to think about creepy stuff. But I enjoy reading it, not so much like watching scary movies, but I'd rather read the scary book.
Yeah, the thing about horror, and what I like about it is it's safe, right? So you can read about something really horrific happening in a book and feel safe and cozy about it because it's not really happening to you. Like I definitely have different forms of horror that I would shy away from more. I'm not really a huge fan of body horror and like really visceral, like gory type horror. I still prefer more of the atmospheric, like disturbing and like psychological horror side of things. But yeah, and it's so funny because horror writers and thriller writers and people that write dark fiction in general are usually the most unassuming, like nicest, warm-hearted people that you could ever imagine meeting. So that dichotomy is always kind of fascinating to me, and also very funny. Like a lot of horror writers are very, very funny people.
What is something that you've learned in writing your from writing your most recent books versus writing your very, very first book?
One of the things I've learned writing my third and fourth books compared to my first and second is that my writing process itself, like the actual craft element of sitting down to start a novel, has become more refined. When I first started out, I was just kind of trying to feel my way through the dark a bit. I had critique partners and I got feedback from other authors, but my process was kind of all over the place. And I wasn't a good pantser. There are a lot of people who are excellent pantsers, like fly by the seat of their pants and can come up with a cohesive, wonderful story without having any kind of plan in place. I'm not one of them. I do much better if I have some scaffolding. So I've learned that about myself, and I had extensive scaffolding for my third novel, and I have extensive scaffolding for my fourth novel. And it has made the writing process a lot more elegant for me. I've had very, very minimal developmental edits for my third and fourth novels, whereas my first and second had fairly extensive developmental edits. And the only thing that I can put that down to as my experience has gotten better, knowing my voice, knowing what I want to convey, but also my planning and preparation has gotten a lot better. So I still do a lot of discovery writing or so-called pantsing while I'm writing, but having that outline and that scaffolding in place enables me to do that, quite honestly, because if I know where I'm going, then it gives me room to play. And it sounds very counterintuitive, and I'll hear that as an argument from a lot of people for why they don't outline, that it's too prohibitive and inhibits them too much. And everybody approaches their process in a different way. And I used to think that too. And then I started outlining because I kind of had to in order to sell books on proposal. Because when you sell on proposal, you have to present an outline or synopsis along with 3 sample chapters. At least that's how my publisher does it. And you can sell your novel without having the full thing completed, which is kind of nice because you get paid while you're actually writing your book instead of after. And I like that. So pretty much I pitch on proposal now, which is a full synopsis and 3 sample chapters. So that has been something that I've learned how to do, and I've learned how to do more efficiently, is to plot and write synopses. And it's been great. And so as compared to when I first started out, that's the biggest change for me.
That does sound like a really interesting and good change because, like you said, it's sort of a roadmap. But if you find yourself taking a different creative direction than what your synopsis had been, do you get that freedom to change things?
Yes, absolutely. Like there are a few plot points that I changed with The Devil and Mrs. Davenport and also with The Witch of Tin Mountain from between the time when I sold the book to my publisher to when I actually started writing, drafting the book. And I like this kind of works better. Usually what I'll do if I have a major change is I'll email my editor and ask, do you think this is going to work? And most of the time they're okay with it. I've never had an incident where they weren't, because the developmental edit after you turn in your full manuscript is kind of when they go in and read and make their suggestions about what's working and what isn't really working, what needs a little bit more fine tuning. And so there's that opportunity. There's always up until you get through copy edits, there's always opportunity to change things pretty dramatically within the novel. So I try not to stress too much about my first drafts anymore. I still do, but I know that my editors are going to help me, and I don't want to get too married to anything at that point of the process. I just mostly want to get the words down so that I get closer to finishing and then make my deadline, and then we dig in and usually have a phone call where we can talk over things. And that really helps me a lot with my process too. There have been significant changes to some of the plot points within the scope of developmental edits, not so much before. I do change things if I really feel like they're necessary, but things have changed fairly dramatically in developmental edits before. And that happens with a lot of authors. Like there have been authors who have gone through complete rewrites during developmental edits, and that is definitely within the realm of possibility.
Well, it sounds like your creative process has been streamlined for the better. Has it changed? What has become your favorite parts of the creative process, or do you still have the same favorite parts of the creative process?
I still have the same favorite parts. I love revision so much more than drafting. When I'm first starting a new draft, I'm really excited and gung-ho. But after the first 20,000 words or so, I start kind of hitting this snag where I'm like, oh, I've got to finish it now. It's like I'm in too deep now. So there's always a little bit of an intimidation factor there with me with drafting, which is a lot down to my imposter syndrome that I still struggle with. I don't think it will ever go away. But revision has always been where I've found my wings and where I've really gotten into the meat of the process of being a writer. I feel like that's when my writing happens, is in my subsequent drafts after I turn in the first draft, because having all of that story already done enables me to look at my writing from a craft standpoint and also from a voice standpoint, to where I can really hone in on those metaphors and similes and descriptions and all of the world building tidbits that kind of make my writing what it is.
So this is a little bit of a departure question, but because The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is an homage, like you said, to homemakers, what is a favorite comfort meal that you enjoy?
Oh gosh, so many. Baked macaroni and cheese is really good. French onion soup, that's one of my favorite comfort meals. Chicken noodle soup, another one. There's a lot of really good things. Like sometimes whenever I'm really craving something salty, it'll be pizza. Nothing can really replace pizza. But I love my mom. She's the one that taught me how to cook, and so we have like our Midwestern and Southern cuisine that we made a lot in Missouri. And one of the first things that I learned how to cook as a child, whenever I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, was biscuits and gravy. Biscuits and gravy are very much a part of where I grew up. And so I still will get an ungodly craving for biscuits and gravy, which are almost impossible to find here in Southern California. There's only one restaurant that serves them, and it's called Black Bear Diner. And they have really good biscuits and gravy. For the most part, I just make it myself because it's just easier. So that would probably be my biggest comfort meal. Right now, I'm doing this series on Instagram, which is really fun, where I'm going through 1950s cookbooks and I'm choosing recipes and making them on Instagram, recipes that my main character, Loretta, probably would have made in the 50s. And I made a Jello salad for the first time ever yesterday, and it actually was really good. And it kind of surprised me because I wasn't expecting it to be good. So, and my mom, she had all those Jello molds and everything that she still had hanging up on the kitchen walls when we were growing up. And she had like a strawberry salad that she would make with them sometimes. It was pretty good, but 1950s, they went all in with those Jello salads.
They did.
They really did. They loved their Jello salads, and maraschino cherries too were in a lot of things.
I have a distinct memory of some sort of Jello salad my mom made, or maybe it was my grandma, and it had shredded carrots in it.
Yes. Yeah,
that's
the
a
recipe
thing.
that I made has it in them. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, lots of shredded carrots, lots of canned pineapple, maraschino cherries, that fruit that isn't really fruit anymore because it's been so processed. Yeah, I'm not sure how healthy it is really, but
Yeah. I really love the nostalgia of older cookbooks. I don't enjoy cooking, but I love looking through cookbooks.
Yeah, they're really fun to look through. The one that I have that belonged to my mom is the original Betty Crocker Look and Cook that was published in 1950, and it has all of these sections on how to be a good entertainer and hostess, and how to lay out an afternoon tea, and how to do all of these things that have kind of gone by the wayside in modern times with how we gather. And there's some of the recipes are really hilarious, and some of them are too complicated. I'm not going to be able to make them for my real series since I only have 90 seconds. So I'm kind of sticking with simple stuff. But there are some of these that I really want to try out just out of curiosity. The appetizer ones are especially funny. Well, there's one appetizer in particular that's called Burning Bush, and it's basically balls of cream cheese that you roll in shredded roast beef, dry shredded roast beef, and spear with a toothpick. And that was one of the most popular appetizers in the 50s. So
that sounds unique.
Yes.
Definitely unique.
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Well, before we go, I was wondering if there's anything else you would like to share with the listeners about you, your books, your writing process.
My next book after The Devil and Mrs. Davenport, I just finished the first draft of that one and sent it to my editor last week. And I'm really excited about that one. It takes place in the 1920s, which I have not visited yet with any of my novels. And I love the 1920s. It's a really cool era. And this novel takes place in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which is a very magical place. It's kind of close to where Tin Mountain would have been in Arkansas. There are actually some characters from The Witch of Tin Mountain that make cameos in The Last Light of Autumn, if it stays titled that. And I've gotten some really great feedback from my agent and two of my other author friends that it's one of the best things I've ever written. So hopefully, hopefully readers will agree. I'm very excited about that one. So it hasn't gone through developmental edits yet, so we'll see how much it changes between now and the time it's published. But yeah, it's basically about a woman who goes to become her great aunt's caregiver in the early 1920s. And her aunt is an acclaimed artist who develops dementia at a fairly young age. She's just in her 60s at the time the novel takes place. And my main character goes to be her companion and live in caregiver because she can no longer live on her own. And I pulled a lot from my own experiences as being a caregiver for both of my parents with this novel. And so Sadie, my main character, in the process of becoming her aunt's companion, discovers that her aunt's paintings, the portraits in her studio, are haunted by the spirits of her former lovers. So they kind of work as a time slip portal into the past. And so it's a way for Sadie to see Marguerite how she was when she was young. And it's a little bit, if The Devil and Mrs. Davenport is my homage to homemakers in the 1950s, this one is my homage to the elderly and older people who sometimes are not valued as much as I believe they should be in society or by society, especially Western society. And so I really wanted to kind of bring that to the fore with this novel and demonstrate to people that even when our bodies begin to break down and betray us, who we are inside, what our souls are always the same. You know, we are who we are from the time we're, you know, little until we die. And I think that is something that with older people and myself getting older, I've noticed that there's a little bit of a disregard to the opinions and just the presence of older people in society. Older women especially tend to become invisible as we age. And I find that very unfortunate because there's this whole wealth of knowledge and wisdom that older people have to offer younger people if younger people will just take the time to listen. So that's kind of the message of my fourth book anyway.
I love that. I love that. I'm looking forward to reading it, especially as a person who works in hospice and palliative care. I feel like I could really connect with that book. But that's such a beautiful message that you point out, and I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. Paulette, thank you so much for being on the show. Listeners, please check the show notes for links to her website, as well as where you can purchase her books. And as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Like the show? Have a question? Stop by the Facebook and Instagram pages. Links are in the show notes, or search for Creative Piecemeal Podcast on social media and click follow for all the latest.